And you can see that the killer whales really go through very energetic chases to catch the species. Killer whales also take minke whales. And again, minkies are reasonably common around Haida Gwaii. Interestingly, they're much more common in parts of the Atlantic than they are in the Pacific, and this may be, in fact, the fact that killer whales are much less common in the Atlantic than they are here. White-sided dolphins, quite common as well in both Dixon Entrance and the north side of just north of the Queen Charlotte's, and then in the South Moresby area as well. These are very agile animals, as you can see. They live, typically seen in very large groups of 100 to several thousand, 2,000-3,000, and very difficult for killer whales to chase down and successfully attack. But they nonetheless, the killer whales give it a try, and occasionally they do take a white-sided dolphin. And finally, this is a fur seal. If you live up in the Charlottes, particularly if you go out to the west side at all, you occasionally see these animals. There's lots of them migrate past the coast every year, but they tend to be fairly far offshore. Populations of transient killer whales, well, there are at least 3 of them that we know about. These are very distinct populations. I want to point to the top one, this little one shown in orange. This is the so-called AT1 population of Prince William Sound, which is only 10 animals now, and it's dying out in front of our eyes, and there's very little that anyone can do except watch it go. And I put this up partly to show that these populations really are vulnerable. We may not. They're long-lived animals, and we may not tend to think of them quite that way, but they're very small groups, and they are vulnerable to things like oil spills. Haida Gwaii, as you can see, is in the middle of West Coast transient territory. And the third culture are the so-called offshores. This is a population of whales, at least 200 of them, that have a very big distribution, and very little is known about them except that they do tend to be offshore, as the name suggests. And again, the Haida Gwaii, particularly the southwest side of Moresby Island, is probably the best place anywhere to encounter offshores. This is a little map showing sighting locations for offshores along the North American coast to show that they do go all the way down to California and all the way out to Alaska. I've been involved for 15 years now, I guess, in genetic studies on killer whales. We use very small darts like this fired with an air rifle to get skin samples from which we extract DNA. And using this and analyzing this DNA has showed us that my colleagues and I that there's an astonishing variety of very genetically distinct killer whale populations off our coast. The 3 well-known or well-defined, if you like, populations of transients, 3 of residents, and 1 of offshores, all overlapping or adjacent. And then further west in Alaska, at least 4 more populations, 2 more transients and 2 more residents. These are all like very, very distinct. First Nations cultures come to mind, if you like, or First Nation tribal groups. Really, they use different vocal patterns. They have different behaviors, and they're very distinct from each other. So you can see that, well, you could see if this was a higher definition map that Haida Gwaii sits right in the middle of the territory of the northern residents, the west coast transients, and the offshore population. So you really can find 3 different kinds of killer whale out there relatively easily. This is just quickly shows the transient killer whales are hunters, so they are very quiet. They use stealth in their hunting. The the fish-eating resident killer whales often chase fish up to the surface. In fact, they usually do. And we can collect scales with a fine mesh net. And scales tell us a lot. If you can get scraps of scales from feeding resident killer whales, you can figure out what the species was, species of fish, how old it was, and sometimes even where it came from. Using this kind of technique to look at prey remains. This slide and the next few slides are all from John Ford at DFO. We can see that resident killer whales really do eat fish exclusively. They occasionally harass marine mammals, but that's shown in yellow here, but they don't kill them. And conversely, transient killer whales kill and occasionally harass marine mammals, but eat no fish at all, as far as we can tell, occasionally harass or kill seabirds. And until very recently, the offshore chart had question marks all the way along, but just in the last couple of years, we've learned that offshore's feed on, their diet includes, at least, fish, halibut, and sharks in particular. We don't know if they also take marine mammals and birds. It's possible that they do. Now, as I mentioned, resident killer whales have this hugely strong predilection, this preference for Chinook salmon. They eat some chum, but very few sockeye. Here's some test fishery results for Johnson Strait. You can see that by far the most common salmon is sockeye, and yet by far the most commonly eaten salmon by resident killer whales is the Chinook. And the second most common is coho. Now, bear in mind that this is from the July to August period. They do take more chum as well in the fall. But they tend to take the rarest salmon, which is interesting. And this shows a graph of the mortality, if you like, of killer whales, resident killer whales, versus the abundance. As salmon become more and more abundant, mortality goes down. Each one of these dots represents a different year. And in years in which salmon abundance is very low, resident mortality spikes. So they're very dependent on Chinook salmon. From Langara Island, where John Ford and Graham Ellison, to a lesser extent myself, have worked for a number of years, we've done genetic analysis on salmon scales taken from killer whales, and we can see that those salmon come from the Skeena, from rivers as close as the Skeena and as far away as the Columbia. There's a real variety of fish taken there. Non-salmonids, they eat herring, rockfish, halibut, and flounder. Much shorter section on the humpbacks. Humpbacks, much larger species of whale. They're a real success story. They've recovered extremely well from exploitation. They're the one really remarkable success story, I think, in terms of post-whaling recovery. Although, as Kathy mentioned, they weren't targeted as heavily by whalers as other species. This is the underside of the chin of a humpback. Notice the barnacles. The top side, they've got this funny little, actually the top of the whale, the head, if you like, the upper part is on the right side of this slide. They're characterized by these knobs. These knobs are really, I think, designed to grow barnacles. They lose the barnacles. These animals, like gray whales, migrate to warm water. In the warm areas, they lose the barnacles every year. They regrow them when they come up into cooler areas. And those barnacles serve as defense. They're like brass knuckles, if you like, if they have to defend themselves against killer whales. And they do. You can imagine a killer whale not wanting to tackle, an animal that can do this sort of thing. Humpbacks are rarely attacked and harassed by killer whales. We think that to the extent that they are, we think that it's calves that are affected. Fisheries and Oceans Department's been doing a photo ID program, a cataloging humpback whales for about 10 years based on their tail characteristics. It's just two humpbacks getting very frisky up in the Queen Charlottes. Their diet includes both krill and fish, small fish. They have this baleen in the roof of the mouth that they filter it out. These photos were taken up around Langara Island. They do this characteristic behavior called flick feeding, which concentrates the prey. I'm not quite sure how, but it's very consistent, and then they'll come up and take the prey right after they flicked. This ring of bubbles shows you that there's a group of humpbacks underneath about to making a column of bubbles to trap fish or krill, and they come up through that column of bubbles in this manner. And again, you can see the baleen, and that's their upper jaws. Finally, they're very associated with seabirds, particularly shearwaters. We can see sometimes huge flocks of shearwaters feeding around humpback killer whales. Humpback whales, I should say. And this is the map of the sightings map for humpbacks around the Queen Charlottes. Again, you'll see that the South Moresby area is very productive. If you project this very similar data set onto bathymetry, you can see that they like the edges of the deep spots. They're not found over very deep water typically, but they are found in areas where there's a transition from shallow to deep. Why is it so? Why is Haida Gwaii so important for cetaceans? I think three principal reasons. First of all, it's an incredibly productive area. This map shows gyres, the Haida gyre, it's called, that spins out of Dixon Entrance, where you can see A there every year, and brings nutrients to the surface. It makes for a very productive environment for krill and small fish. The environments, of course, in both terrestrial and marine are very pristine on the Queen Charlotte Islands, high productivity. And finally, there's very low disturbance and underwater noise, at present at least, still around Haida Gwaii. Very little industrial development and relatively little shipping. which works to the favor of killer whales. So thank you very much.